We all love our Sega Genesises, but playing the games, at least in their original form, isn't getting any easier. Modern displays do not play nice with those old video signals, and old school CRTs are dropping like flies. All the while, those old consoles and cartridges are inevitably deteriorating. Whether we like it or not, emulation, whether hardware or software, is ultimately where we're all headed. The good news is that the Genesis or Mega Drive has a pretty decent presence on modern consoles, like the PS5 and Switch 2, with more actual ports of these games than you might think, and not just the super popular titles either, although we like having those too. And unlike when you emulate these sorts of games yourself on your PC or something, these official releases tend to come with extra features, sometimes bonus content, and more importantly, are totally legal to play in perpetuity, and you're not in some kind of weird gray area. So let's take a look at some Sega Genesis/Mega Drive games that I've found deep in the bowels of PSN, and some of the features that they bring to the table, and whether or not I think they're worth the asking price. And keep in mind, every game that I'm going to mention here is also available on the Nintendo eShop. So if the Switch 1 or 2 is more your jam, well, you can play them there as well. So Konami did a thing I honestly never thought I'd see them do: put Rocket Knight Adventures on modern consoles. In fact, Rocket Knight Adventures Resparked is actually a collection of all 3 mainline games from the 16-bit era. 3 separate games that each command much heftier price tags on their own than this collection ever has, and probably ever will. I've always been a huge fan of the original game, so I was really excited to grab a physical version from Limited Run when it was announced. However, because I'm also a complete idiot, I immediately forgot about it entirely until I randomly came across it on PSN for like $20 a year and a half later. If you don't already know, Rocket Knight Adventures is a really fun action game from Konami back when they still made really fun action games. Unlike Contra or Castlevania though, this game's a little bit more approachable. That's not to say it's easy though. In fact, I kind of feel like the gameplay is a little bit too unwieldy and chaotic for its own good sometimes. But with enemies that go down fairly easily, and Sparkster himself being a bit of a juggernaut, it's nothing the average player can't handle with some moderate effort. Sparkster's sword is sort of a medium-range projectile, and he can also violently launch himself in basically any direction, destroying almost anything stupid enough to be in his way. And that rocket ability is essential for exploring the levels and avoiding hazards, as well as doing damage to certain bosses, so it's a pretty big part of the gameplay, as the title suggests. But it's also one of the most chaotic parts. It doesn't really send Sparkster where you're trying to go half the time, and the bouncing off of some surfaces can feel downright nonsensical as you careen around the stage and just kind of have to deal with wherever you wind up. So while it is amusing to do, it generally works best in the very specific moments where the game requires it. The real-time rewinding function in this version, though, gives you the ability to be a little bit more experimental, so feel free to do that. Odds are you'll discover a few secrets, because there are plenty of those around. Sparkster is a possum though, so of course he can hang upside down from certain platforms, which can add a little bit of depth to the platforming and even the combat sometimes. So while it doesn't reinvent the wheel, the game definitely has a feel of its own, and I think it's a lot of fun despite being kind of wonky sometimes. Almost every level has some sort of hook or a weird little diversion to make them all stand out. Some really excellent minecart sections, underwater levels that are actually fun to play, and a giant robot boxing match because, you know, why not? They throw a lot of things in this game, pretty much the kitchen sink treatment, but in a good way. Everything feels fun and somehow natural. The graphics, as you can see, are outstanding for the time and take advantage of basically every effect the Genesis was capable of. Another thing Konami was really good at back then. Tons of scrolling layers, dithering foregrounds like the water here that actually look really good, and the aesthetic just uses a really appealing combination of Saturday morning cartoon characters, kind of, with possums and evil pig dudes being pretty much the main focus, but with just enough implied violence and edginess to it to keep it from feeling too kiddie or silly, which was extremely appealing to my 5-year-old self in 1993 and honestly still is. The Genesis had a lot of these edgy, anthropomorphic character action games like Battletoads and Dinosaurs for Hire, and even the Sonic games, I would say, and I'd put Rocket Knight right in that same club. The music is similarly excellent, and it was composed primarily by Michiru Yamane, who would immediately go on to do the soundtrack for Castlevania Bloodlines and solidify herself as one of the all-time greats. All these things coming together makes Rocket Knight Adventures a real classic and an overall just good-ass time. The game reviewed extremely well at release and eventually spawned a sequel, the oddly named Sparkster on the Genesis and Sparkster Rocket Knight Adventures on the Super Nintendo. Changing the name of the franchise only 2 games in is definitely a choice, and I don't imagine that did the IP any favors. The sequel also made some big gameplay changes and seems to be a bit more divisive as a result, which I totally get. On one hand, I think Sparkster plays a little bit better overall. The gameplay isn't as chaotic. Combat is a little more deliberate and reliable, and the rocket ability charges up on its own and seems to behave a little bit more predictably, which I think makes it more fun to use and experiment with outside of the moments where it's absolutely needed to progress. There's also little rocket packs kind of scattered around the levels that immediately launch you forward upon touching them, so it definitely seems like the developers wanted to encourage the rocket stuff a lot more this time by just making it a little simpler and easier to use, and I think they accomplished that. The sword, however, is a little bit slower and lost its projectile element. It's still perfectly fine, but this change kind of results in a loss of that pseudo run-and-gun feel that the original was flirting with, which was one of its more unique elements. There's also a neat little slot machine thing that happens whenever you get 10 of these little jewels that can give you anything from extra lives to just dropping a bomb on Sparkster's head, so that's kind of fun and keeps you on your toes. The levels in this game don't have as much of a wow factor as they did in the original, but there's still plenty of variety between them and some pretty neat sections that really stand out. It's still very clearly a game from P. Konami. Plus, the bosses, while not always super memorable, are still fun to take down. Sparkster isn't as much of a roller coaster ride as that first game, but I do like that it's a bit more polished and consistent with what it does. Both games are fantastic though, and I enjoy them and recommend them both equally, just for slightly different reasons. Now, Sparkster Rocket Knight Adventures is the Super Nintendo version of that Sega Genesis sequel. And since Super Nintendo isn't really the focus of this video, I'll just leave my review at this. It's also very good, although maybe my least favorite of the 3. It plays pretty much exactly like the Genesis Sparkster, except here the sword gets that projectile element back from the first game, and the rocket thing needs to be charged manually again, also like the first game. So it's yet another configuration to the formula to divide fans of the series further, and contribute to the franchise never quite finding its footing. I feel like if they had just stuck with what the first game did and just kind of refined it over time instead of overhauling it so much, Konami probably would have struck a little bit more of an identity with this, and who knows, maybe they could have had their own Sonic the Hedgehog here. But for what it's worth, we did get 3 excellent 16-bit games out of this, and this is a great way to play all 3 of them. Certainly a convenient and affordable option, if nothing else. The masterfully animated little intro sequence sets the tone for the level of quality and care that clearly went into this. Any fan of these games is sure to get a kick out of this alone. More importantly though, the emulation of the games is handled extremely well across all 3 games, with, as far as I can tell, functionally perfect versions of them. Input latency feels about as minimal as can be expected, and the music and sound effects sound pitch perfect in my ear. There's a buttload of concept art and old promotional material to sift through, which I always really enjoy, and dedicated music players for all 3 games. On top of that, you got your save states, real-time rewinding, and a CRT filter, which is actually rather nice, and doesn't darken or distort the image too much like a lot of other modern collections tend to do. And there's also trophy support if you want to get into all of that. This is one of those modern collections of retro games I can recommend to pretty much anybody. Existing fans of the series, like myself, will definitely enjoy all the bells and whistles, as well as the high level of care and attention that went into this, while newcomers are given an accurate, fully featured way to experience all 3 games without having to take out a second mortgage. About 10-ish years ago, Sega released an official compilation of a bunch of Genesis games for PlayStation and Switch, and curiously delisted it just a few years later, which was pretty odd. However, if you still have access to it, either through the digital or physical version, it's still perfectly playable on PS5, Switch 2, and pretty much everything else. And it's a pretty darn good collection for the 20-ish bucks it tends to go for. You've got the Sonics and the Streets of Rage games that you would expect, but also a handful of wild cards that I really think make this collection worth getting, including Toejam and Earl and its sequel, making both games in this roundabout kind of way perfectly playable on modern platforms. Panic on Funkatron is a direct sequel to the original cult classic Toejam and Earl that really did its own thing on the Genesis, and remains one of its most celebrated games. It often overshadows the sequel though, which is a shame because Panic on Funkatron is actually a fantastic game on its own. Story-wise, it pretty much picks up right where the first one left off. Toejam and Earl finally put their spaceship back together and got away from all the freaks on Earth, only to return home and find that a bunch of them somehow came along, and are now overrunning Toejam and Earl's home planet and being super annoying. So it's up to TJ and Earl to throw jars at them and haul them away like SpongeBob and Patrick when they thought they were on the moon in that one episode. The gameplay here definitely takes a sharp turn into a more traditional side-scrolling platformer direction, and as a result it does feel less unique than the original, at least at first. And I think that's part of why it doesn't get brought up as much. But still, on its own merits, I'd say this is a well above average platforming game with a lot of surprises and charm and variety. Like the original, it's full of great characters, and an absurd amount of funky 90s and late 80s hip-hop stuff. The developers clearly had a very specific idea of just where Toejam and Earl came from, and it's very much unlike anything else you'll ever see, certainly in a 16-bit video game. It also maintains most of that sense of exploration the original game did so well, with lots of secret areas and random little side quests to get distracted by. You'll also just randomly get led around the stage by these buttons that just kind of pop out and do random stuff, like give you items or transport you to other random locations. Or things like this jumping minigame where you just suddenly are getting judged by these guys down in the corner for your technique for no real reason. Also, portals to a bonus stage open up a lot, though it is the same one every time and is mostly just a test to see how long you can go without either running out of time or accidentally hitting the exit. So yeah, you can just hunt down the humans and beat the level if you want, but really the fun of this game is running around and exploring and seeing just how goofy and ridiculous everything gets. The game does throw some abilities your way as well to help even the odds with all the Earthlings, like the ability to see where they're hiding, as well as potentially harmful items to avoid. Also a little teleport ability that really helps out in a few situations. All of these things cost funk though, of course, so you can't just use them all willy-nilly. Although you do earn funk back pretty regularly, so as long as you're not overusing these abilities, you generally have them when you need them. Overall, I'd say Panic on Funkatron looks really great, arguably more appealing than the first game, at least in my opinion. I think the pinky purpley alien world and all the weird vegetation and creatures that you see everywhere just make it really fun to just look around. It's really kind of shocking that they never really elaborated on this world at all with future games. It's definitely one of the Toejam and Earl franchise's greatest strengths. I do wish stages stood out a little bit from each other, a little bit better I guess, but I find the game so generally entertaining that I just don't care that much about that. Even the underwater sections, which generally I'm not a big fan of in these sorts of games, I actually really enjoy. They're not too massive and distracting, but they do have some secrets here and there worth exploring for. My favorite little distraction, though, is probably the Simon Says rhythm games that you get wrapped up in, that test your ability to memorize patterns and repeat them back at the correct rhythm. Your mileage may vary. The music in Panic on Funkatron is pretty much perfect and exactly what you would expect. It does continue the style of the first game's music, but I think it actually builds on it some here. It's got that early hip-hop edge to it, but also definitely seems influenced by 70s funk. And that's an interesting mix, as a guy who grew up listening to a lot of Earth, Wind & Fire, Kool and the Gang, and stuff like that. So the soundtrack definitely hits a unique sweet spot, and I'm kind of surprised they haven't done more with it. Whoever owns the rights to this music really needs to start releasing some remastered vinyls or something, I don't know. having access to this version of Panic on Funkatron as well as the original Toejam and Earl makes grabbing this collection worth it on its own. Not to mention some of the other great games on here that you rarely hear about, like Biohazard Battle. Biohazard Battle is a rather unique little side-scrolling shmup that I really enjoy, despite forgetting that it exists sometimes. It's not super flashy with its graphics or particularly memorable with its music, but it does have a strange and unique vibe that I really like. Like it's caught somewhere between Insector X and some sort of kaiju game. Everything is extremely menacing and strange and alien, and the story is actually pretty interesting. You're choosing between 4 of these otherworldly monsters to help the survivors of a biological war that turned into an apocalypse clear out the planet of these strange monsters and make it habitable again. And the general difficulty of the game more or less reflects the gravity of that situation, with some extremely tough sections that you pretty much always feel underpowered for. This is definitely one of those shooters where mastering your little satellites is pretty much required for survival, since that's about the only tool you have at your disposal anyway, outside of the very incremental upgrades and a chargeable blast that, while certainly powerful, rarely feels worth the momentary ceasefire needed to charge it up and use it. Although thanks to the save states in this collection, you can eke your way through them, which is nice if you've only got so much free time but would still like to see the game through. Or, of course, you can totally ignore that stuff and just play the game as God intended, getting destroyed dozens of times and restarting the whole thing once your continues run out. Each monster has a different default speed, and as usual, I tend to avoid the slower ones in exchange for starting out with weaker weapons. My thinking is you can always upgrade or alter your weapons in Biohazard Battle, but your speed is just what it is, as far as I can tell. Perhaps my favorite thing about this game, though, is that it really strikes its own sort of personality, which is something I can't say about a lot of 16-bit shoot-'em-ups. This otherworldly aesthetic is in full force throughout the entire game. As random abominations leap out at you from all directions, you'll occasionally notice remnants of the civilization that existed before, and you can't help but feel a little curious about what they were like, and if there's even enough of this world left to be worth salvaging. That's where my thoughts go anyway. I'm genuinely not sure how I feel about the music overall because, on one hand, it is kind of one note and sort of drab, and definitely lacks variety to some degree, but on the other hand, it's very strange and unsettling and therefore fits the game perfectly, so I don't know. It definitely does its job, even though I don't find it particularly fun to listen to. Although there are a couple little melodies here and there that will wiggle their way into your ears and maybe hang out for a little bit. Overall, I definitely recommend it though, especially if you're a fan of shmups and want something a little strange and different. It's not a very common Genesis game and will generally run you much more on its own than this collection ever goes for, so if you don't have either, but you do have a Switch or a modern PlayStation or Xbox, I say go this route. Now there's a lot of complaints about the UI for this collection, which actually I think looks pretty cool, but yeah, it's very slow and clunky and the visual filters are just kind of whatever, although getting achievements for individual games is kind of fun, and so are the trophies if you really want to dig into it. But the main reason to get it, I think, is so you can have access to a handful of these more obscure titles. And again, if you don't already own the digital version, you gotta go physical, which frankly I recommend doing anyway. Not only does that disc ensure you always have this collection, but it also comes with a pretty sweet reversible poster. Now this one might be cheating a little bit since it didn't technically get a Western port to the actual Genesis, but was instead stuck on the Mega Drive until now. Though if you're watching this video, you're probably fine with that, as you should be because this fancy standalone release of Panorama Cotton is a pretty fascinating port for a few reasons. Firstly, Panorama Cotton itself is a huge departure from what you would expect from a Cotton game, if not the biggest departure the series has ever tried, in that it's not a 2D side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, but instead it's another one of those over-the-shoulder Space Harrier-style games. And like I said in my review of Burning Force, in part 2 of my Sega Genesis Hidden Gems series, this is still not my favorite genre. I tend to find these games kind of clunky and difficult to acclimate to a lot of the time, with very few exceptions, Burning Force being one of them because of its super smooth frame rate. And while Panorama Cotton runs more like Space Harrier 2 on the Genesis than Burning Force, I'd still say this is one of the better iterations of this formula that I've played, at least from the 16-bit era. For the most part, this game plays exactly how you think it does, and I think as an idea, that makes a lot of sense. Pseudo 3D games that bent the rules of 2D consoles were popular at the time, and Cotton already had a few games that more or less played the same. So why not branch out with something a little different? And as a 1994 Mega Drive title, I'm sure the folks at Sunsoft wanted something that could really take advantage of the console and show off and stand out a little bit. And that it definitely does. The sheer amount of colors and animation and movement on screen pretty much the entire game is impressive for sure. The enemies are some of the most surreal and bizarre in the entire franchise, which is saying a lot. And some levels change up entirely multiple times, making them kind of feel like several mini-levels all crammed into one, which is actually pretty cool and unique for the genre. And while the somewhat low frame rate does kind of make it hard to appreciate the presentation to some extent, it's impossible to not appreciate the totality of what you are able to comprehend. The action is roughly the same sort of thing that you would expect to be doing in Space Harrier, but because you're Cotton, you're also collecting crystals and upgrading your weapons. Nothing crazy, though the special weapons and abilities do add a bit more variety and give you some real choice in how you deal with certain enemies. The general difficulty is, I'd say, somewhat high, and not always for the right reasons. Some environmental hazards can feel a bit unfair and borderline impossible to anticipate, like these moving blocks that don't really have a larger pattern to them. You just kind of need to memorize the positions that they're in when you get to them. Although the ability to slow down and speed up at will does kind of balance that out a little bit. And of course, the instant rewinding function that all of NN's retro ports seem to have can bail you out of the headache of actually losing lives and starting over when these sorts of things show up. And despite the little bit of jank here and there, I was able to acclimate to the relatively choppy performance after not too long. I also get the sense that Cotton's hitbox is fairly generous, so all that works in your favor and counters the delirium a little bit. The music is also quite good overall, with some pretty catchy stuff. Wackier tone than the music from the previous Cotton games for sure, but it makes sense that the audio would match the visuals' energy here. So while Panorama Cotton doesn't quite turn me into a bigger fan of the genre that it's a part of, the zany graphics and trippy levels definitely add a lot of entertainment value. One of the bigger motivators to keep playing it is to just see what sort of ridiculous enemies and wild level designs are coming up next. And I have to admit, I do enjoy the boss fights, even though they're not particularly well balanced. Even though the lion's share of the text seems to have not been translated, I do think this modern version of the game is probably the ideal way to play it. Steel Empire has been one of my favorite shoot-'em-ups for a very long time. No other shooter looks quite like this one, with its disheveled, gritty, steampunk aesthetic. Each stage is full of rusty browns and reds and deep purples, making each of them stand apart from each other and also making the entire game distinguish itself in the shoot-'em-up genre. And while so many other steampunk games with this look have kind of disappeared into the crowd, Steel Empire still manages to stand out. Perhaps because it's not just window dressing here, but instead this permeates every aspect of the game. The agile Striker airplane and the more durable Zeppelin are perfect examples of the game's unwavering dedication to this aesthetic. I like playing both, but I gotta admit the Zeppelin is dramatically more difficult, and not always in a fun way. Sure, it can take marginally more damage before going down, but it's also much slower, and the notably larger hitbox creates even more of a disadvantage, and often makes the game's many tight spaces and fast-moving obstacles much more difficult to navigate. Just about everything you see in this game looks like it fell off of a train in 1920. Yet the game also has a hint of futurism, with some streaks of science fiction occasionally bubbling to the surface. The game quickly makes use of its various twists on the shmup formula, like the ability to shoot forward and backwards becoming more of a requirement than a choice a lot of the time, making that little extra dash of tactical depth a part of the game's personality instead of just a thing that you can do. Steel Empire also employs a very simplified version of RPG-like progression, as you regularly get to level up your firepower by collecting experience-based power-ups to build towards your next powerful milestone, instead of just grabbing instant upgrades like most shoot-em-ups from the time. Outside of all that, the gameplay is fairly standard side-scrolling shmup stuff, with screen-clearing bombs, multi-stage boss battles, ground and aerial enemies to stay on top of, and the occasional bout of slowdown, so fans of the genre should slip into this one pretty easily. Enemy variety certainly could be a little bit better though, and you will notice the same handful of design concepts getting shuffled around a bit more than you might like, and certainly a bit more than you would notice it in other higher profile shooters of the time. Steel Empire isn't terribly difficult either, especially when compared to a lot of other shmups you'll find from this era. While it does ramp up significantly towards the end, I'd say it's a smooth incline for most of the game, making it a really good choice for beginners or just intermediate players like myself that might not necessarily be in the mood to have their heads caved in. Despite not being quite as flashy or dazzling as something like Truxton or Musha, I'd still say in terms of general quality, Steel Empire stands among the best of them. And it's handled pretty much perfectly here. The extra features are kinda minimal, but what's here is nice. The game itself is emulated quite well, though the old film flickering effect from the intro seems to have been completely removed here, which strangely I'm kind of okay with. Normally, I definitely want these ports to be as accurate as possible, warts and all, from a game preservationist perspective, but I'm not exactly complaining in this case. But like the Rocket Knight Adventures port, this is really more of a collection. You not only have the Genesis and Mega Drive variant of Steel Empire, but also both regions of the Game Boy Advance version of the game that came out a few years later, which I actually ended up enjoying more than I thought I would. You can definitely tell it was meant for a smaller screen, but overall this is still a totally acceptable version of the game, and it's interesting to see the differences. The other game, Over Horizon, is also included, and I'm not really sure what the connection is, other than the same developer seemingly being involved. Maybe that's it, and I've never actually heard about it before this. And while I wasn't super impressed with it at first, it has grown on me a little bit. It's clearly an NES game though, so I'll leave my thoughts on it at that for now. But rest assured, this little collection is a solid way to play Steel Empire, and if you're like me and haven't played the GBA version or Over Horizon before, then I think that really seals the deal in terms of value. Again, there's not much in terms of extras or bonus content, but the games themselves are solid and worth a few bucks, so I think it's worth snatching up. A Genesis game that has had zero modern availability that I'm aware of until very recently is Final Zone from Wolf Team and Renovation. This was a fairly early title for the Genesis, and it does show with some very simple gameplay and fairly average graphics and music. Though I gotta say, despite being a bit of an acquired taste, Final Zone has a nice flow to it. It's a very simple, isometric shooter on a mechanical level, but it's got an element of discovery and explorability that does add a little something. You actually have to explore and track down the enemies on your own and take them out before leaving, as opposed to just surviving till the end like most shooters of the time. This isn't always my type of thing, but here, for some reason, it really works, especially if you're in the right mood for something like that, at least for a couple of levels at a time. Repetition does rear its ugly head eventually. Unlike a lot of the modern ports of retro games I tend to cover, the UI here is totally unique to this game. I've never seen it before, and it's not super intuitive, but it gets the job done and has a good amount of options. You've got several different scalers, filters, and even some shaders, and a frame skip option to minimize lag. But honestly, I didn't feel any notable lag at any point with everything on default settings, so I'm not sure how necessary that is. The shaders are kinda cool, but in this game's case, I think it looks fine without anything on top of it. Most importantly though, the game plays well, and it feels authentic to play it this way. Shooting and automatically strafing when holding down the fire button is easy to get used to, and I kinda wish more of these free-roam top-down shooters played like that. The tight camera angle though can feel a little bit restrictive at times. Considering how fast and hectic the action can get, it'd be a lot better if more of the area was generally visible. It's definitely a product of its time though, in that large, detailed sprites were all the rage back then. even if they came at the cost of pretty much everything else. And while I do appreciate the rather large arsenal of weaponry you can experiment with, doing so will quickly reveal that most of them don't really alter how the game plays at all, and that a lot of them are downright interchangeable, so the combat will feel a little bit more shallow once you realize that. Also, getting hurt in just the right ways can render you defenseless, which I understand as a concept, but I don't really think it works as a fun gameplay mechanic. The save states and rewind function all work as they should though, and that does take some of the bite out of Final Zone's rougher edges, making this, in my opinion, a pretty clear preferable way to play the game at this point. I'd probably say Final Zone is one of Renovation's weaker games. I'd much rather see ports of Aero Flash, Elemental Master, or Whip Rush, but at the same time, I wouldn't say this is something to pass on. For the extremely friendly price, it's a rather fun game, especially in short bursts, and really reminds you of that early Sega Genesis era of games that might have prioritized style over substance a little bit too much, but still gave way to a lot of cool experiences that you wouldn't have found on anything else. Everybody who hasn't been living under a rock over the last few years knows that Konami has acquired a taste for cashing in on their 16-bit games via some very well-handled collections with the help of M2 in recent years. This has turned out to be a great formula, and I hope to see more of it. While the Castlevania collections tend to steal the spotlight, I also think it's worth mentioning that Contra was given the golden treatment as well. And within this collection of Contra games, we have what I think is easily one of the best run-and-guns of all time, Contra Hardcore, the one and only Contra game to ever officially come to the Genesis, which is sort of a crime against humanity, but it is what it is. You can also play the European version, Probotector, which is pretty much the same game outside of the characters being switched out for robots, because Europe. Hardcore gives you a few different characters to choose from. All of them are great, and feel like they just fell out of an 80s science fiction action movie. They also have their own versions of the weapons, which I really like. I think I enjoy Sheena's variants the most, but they're all good. Alternate levels can also be selected at certain story junctions, which also affects the game's ending, so right there's several good reasons to play this game multiple times, which you'll probably want to do anyway because this game is so damn good. The action is absolutely wild and basically perfect here. Every level is a complete roller coaster of exploding vehicles, collapsing buildings, and just general mayhem. At any point, everything could completely explode and change the level entirely. And as the stages get more complex and grotesque, you really get the feeling that you're fighting your way deeper and deeper into some extremely dangerous areas. The bosses also tend to change form and get more difficult as you go along, so you're never really comfortable. It feels kind of similar to Gunstar Heroes or Alien Soldier in that way. Also, like those games, Contra Hardcore seems to push the Genesis to its absolute limit, with some crazy scaling effects and tons of animation pretty much all the time, although there's just enough restraint so that everything makes sense within this world. It's an extremely well-optimized game and epitomizes the greatness of 1990s Konami in just about every way. Including the music, which is an energetic combination of scratchy thrash metal and dark techno that keeps your blood pressure high, while fitting perfectly with the onslaught of enemies and bullets and platforms taking over the screen so much of the time. The only real downside with this game, in my opinion, is arguably the one-hit deaths. I know that's pretty much ingrained in the Contra franchise, but I think in this game, that little health bar that they give you in the Japanese version makes for a better experience overall. Still, you do have the ability to quick save, which you can and should use to make sure you can see through the whole game without losing your mind or breaking your thumbs. You still gotta get good to some extent though, or else you'll just be constantly saving and loading, and that's no fun. This is not a game to play while drunk or tired. While the precision this game often demands is pretty extreme a lot of the time, it never quite steps over into feeling what I would call unfair, and the epic crashing and burning of the bosses upon defeat is more than worth the struggle. That's how you make a real 10 out of 10 game. Outside of that, I guess there's not a whole lot more to say about this game that hasn't already been said a million times. It's a fantastic Sega Genesis game, and you get all three versions of it here, on top of a bunch of other Contra games which are all fantastic. So just make sure you grab this collection sometime. It's absolutely worth it. Sagaia, or Sagaia, we'll go with Sagaia, is one of many Darius games included in the Darius Cosmic Collection. And if you've played any game in this series, you largely know what to expect here. Challenging shoot-'em-up action, tons of alternate paths and bosses, and a whole lot of vaguely fish-themed enemies that will overwhelm you if you let them. The key, as with a lot of these sorts of games, is to get your upgrades and hold on to them for dear life. Unlike a lot of other shooters on the Genesis though, most of the levels in this game do start off a little bit slow, and they give you a good chance to get your bearings before coming down on you like a ton of bricks. Even the later stages seem to give you that small little window of opportunity to get your act together, so there is that little bit of breathing room, just in case you limped out of the last boss battle with nothing but your basic fire. I appreciate that. That's not to say Sagaia is easy though, it definitely is not. Some of these later stages will absolutely push your hand-eye coordination to the limit. It's another M2 collection though, so you know you're getting a fair shake with an extremely accurate port of the game and several save states if you want them. Darius 2 isn't the most impressive Genesis game by any means. The music is kind of average, and only occasionally flirts with being much better than that, and the graphics, while cool, generally aren't that special. There's some nice background effects that show up here and there, like the fire in the first level, and some backgrounds getting all warpy and crazy, and there's also some nice layering in some stages, though for the most part it's pretty basic, and that's okay. They use contrasting colors well to give a nice sense of depth, and largely just kind of stay out of the way and let you focus on the action. Not a graphical showcase for the Genesis, but I'd say it's a good-looking game that mostly just lets the action do the talking. It also has a very nice sense of pacing. No one level goes on for particularly long, and bosses don't linger on too long after you've largely mastered what they're doing. Something that really sets Darius games apart in the genre is the focus on enemies above and below you for pretty much the whole game. Most shmups will have stuff come at you from all around at certain times, but Darius games lean into that a lot more, which is why upgrading your bombs and vertically firing weapons is just as important as anything else, if not more so. And again, the boss battles are more fun than you might think, some of which have you flying all around the screen and automatically turning around as needed, kind of like Dead Moon on the Turbo. I'd really like to see M2 take a whack at porting that one someday. Anyway, Darius 2, or Sagaia, or Sagaia, or whatever it is a classic shoot-'em-up that I think all fans of the genre need to at least try. And since that original Genesis version ain't getting any cheaper, this collection is a perfectly acceptable way to play it. Plus, you get a bunch of other Darius games, like the one from the PC Engine, the Super Nintendo, Sega Master, and even some extra modes, like boss rushes that weren't included in those original games. Now, this one tends to not go on sale very often, and the price tag is up there, at least in terms of these sorts of ports. Although I paid full price for it when it came out, and I have no regrets, so take that for what you will. So, hopefully I've made a good case as to why it's important to keep an eye on some of these modern ports of classic games, and why it's also important to support the ones that really get it right, because our level of support or lack of support for these sorts of things right now will determine their availability in the future. And with that in mind, I do want to give a special shout out to the standalone releases, like the Final Zone or Panorama Cotton. These are extremely obscure games that I did not expect to see resurface in any meaningful mainstream way like this, and I'm glad that they did. So let me know of some other modern ports of retro games that you think are worth checking out for one reason or another, and also let me know if any of the games I brought up today were a surprise to you. I'd like to think that I'm being somewhat helpful to somebody somewhere. Maybe some fan of Final Zone out there just had no idea, and now they know and they can grab that obscure-ass game. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.